TIL that Ulysses S. Grant created the Department of Justice, ratified the 15th Amendment and asked for Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1871, enabling him to combat and prosecute the Ku Klux Klan. This is my moment. I was born for this. Ahem. Grant is underrated. And then lost causers undid a lot of his work and spent decades tearing him down and making Americans think poorly of him. He was a good man and a better general, better than Lee, because you can see once Jackson died Lee's strategies turned sour. He seemed to get an unfair bad reputation when going over his presidency in school. Grant's autobiography is as underrated as his presidency. Go out and read it. Today you also learn that presidents do not ratify amendments. As a direct descendant of Grant, I could have used a little less genetic predisposition to violent alcoholism. Can't win them all right. He also appointed the first Native American Commissioner of Indian Affairs, his friend Ulysses S. Parker of the Seneca Nation. Parker was with Grant at Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Great man. Crazy to think he's voted as one of the shittiest presidents in history despite making bold attempts in Congress. We need another Grant in 2020. Grant's presidency is slowly but surely being vindicated by history. And somehow he's remembered as a slave owner because a family member left him slaves in their will. He freed them immediately. Just goes to show it doesn't matter how much good you do, people only remember the bad. Let's continue the fight against the KKK. They should be labeled a gang or domestic terror organization. Grant continually rises in ranks as one of my favorite presidents, and he got those agents to stop that giant mechanical spider from destroying the US. Truly a visionary. Grant's reputation got killed in the early 20th century by lost cause sympathizers and Southern historians. He's having a bit of a renaissance amongst presidential historians this century, however. After having read Rob Chernow's wonderful biography on him, I personally consider him a top 5 American of all time. Edit, Ron not Rob Chernow. I'd also like to add that Grant was one of the few Union generals that the South cheered for after the war. He showed incredible generosity at Appomattox while overseeing the surrender of Lee's army. He was known as Grant the Magnanimous, a pretty terrible nickname that probably didn't help in him gaining recognition for his accomplishments. And then Woodrow Wilson instituted the second KKK, fucked up American foreign policy, something we still live with today, joined WW1 and messed up the peace conference, and lastly was a horrible person. Teddy Roosevelt should have won. Nick Offerman needs to play him in a movie. Then everything changed when Rutherford B. Hayes attacked. A real manly man's man. Fuck the Confederacy, Nazis, and the KKK. He was also a general, I think. Look guys. $50 bill. I've been reading his memoirs during this pandemic, and I concur, massively underrated man with an interesting life in an interesting time. Very good writer too. Presidents serve no role in ratifying constitutional amendments. After seeing this post I went down a wiki rabbit hole and read about his successor, Rutherford Hayes. I had never heard of him, but he's definitely also underrated AF. I didn't even know who he was until I read his biography 3 years ago by Robert White. I became Grant-toxicated, in the words of Mark Twain. He is my favorite president so far. Nowhere in this thread do I see anyone discussing the Department of Justice. The postman at my previous job was a dead ringer for Ulysses S. Grant. Woodrow Wilson. I'm gonna pretend I didn't see that. The president has no formal role in the ratification of constitutional amendments. That title is misleading. And then Woodrow Wilson showed Birth of a Nation in the White House like it was a documentary. Seems like instead of constantly trying to better this country, many presidents focus on destroying what came before out of pure spite rather than the good of the people. Progress is slow, but it's important to remember that we are the infinite typewriters and the infinite monkeys trying to write Shakespeare. We nailed Shakespeare, but a perfect system of government is a little more complicated, I suppose. People even remotely in the realm of Grant these days are thrown under the bus, ignored, or completely villainized. And then Hoover created the FBI to ignore the KKK and focus on Black Panthers. Lincoln is a tough act to follow. For several presidents in a row, Grant's one of those complex characters with both large virtues and large flaws. He was personally of strong moral character, but was a terrible judge of people, and charismatic people found him not difficult to manipulate. Overall a very interesting man and life lived. Back when being the president actually meant something and wasn't just a flashy title. My son was born on Monday. He is a direct descendant of Ulysses S. Grant on his mother's side. He's his 6X great-grandfather. Pretty cool. I've read several biographies about him since finding this out. Grant did more for black people than any president until LBJ. His reputation suffered horribly for it, too, as revisionist Southern historians trashed his reputation for decades, exaggerating Grant's drinking problem, which he'd most likely kicked prior to holding office, and corruption in his White House, which was mostly due to the massive expansion of federal government post-Civil War and the lack of regulatory controls to cope with it. The period immediately after the Civil War is one of the darkest chapters in U.S. history and it's been largely forgotten. Bands of terrorist groups openly murdered thousands of freed slaves. Grant did his damnedest to end it. I grew up constantly hearing that Ulysses S. Grant was a bad president. It turns out that, like many historical fables, this was mainly post-war Southern propaganda. Grant had the right idea about the KKK. Right after the Civil War they were treated like enemy combatants. Compared to him to yesterday when our president issued his tweet to not to count mail-in ballots for an entire state. Glad this happened when it did, because if it was today they would just be called very fine people. He's one of the greatest people to be president. He served wherever his country sent him and served well. Arguably America's greatest ever general who always fought with an eye towards the economy of life for his soldiers. His soldiers generally ate better, wore more comfortable clothes, got proper boots, weapons, and other pieces of kit, and had some of the lowest rates of mortality for combat armies of that era. He pioneered total war and fought one of the most miraculous campaigns in American military history, if not global military history, to take Vicksburg. He quite literally wrote the book on combined arms doctrine and amphibious assaults. Sam Grant was adored by his soldiers and respected by his peers. The only true stain on his reputation was General Order No. 11, the only official anti-Semitic action taken by the U.S. government, which was quickly quashed by Lincoln, which he spent the rest of his life trying to make amends for by having the U.S. launch a diplomatic intervention in Romania to stop a pogrom and by appointing many capable and competent Jews to the federal bureaucracy. In retirement he actually predicted many of the changes that would occur in WW1. When he died he was one of America's most beloved presidents. His reputation was sullied by historians of the lost cause, though subsequent scholarly work by J. F. C. Fuller and other historians restored Grant's good name. Smiling face with smiling eyes, no wonder the Confederacy put up all those pity trophy statues. I'd be pretty salty too if I was too stupid to win a war against a drunk. The thing about Grant is that he gets undeserved rep because of being a drunk and an unsuccessful businessman. And because of Sherman's dealing with natives. A real man. Imagine how different America would be today if Grant hadn't given up halfway through Reconstruction and abandoned the South to be taken over and run by literal terrorists. For sure Grant, at least in the beginning, tried to do the right thing. But when you then have literal armed terrorist mobs like the Red Shirts, storming state courthouses and Capitol buildings, murdering elected officials in broad daylight, you do not cede the government to those terrorists. Killing the previous elected official should not enable you to take their place in America. But that is what Grant's administration allowed to happen in the South. Blame the failure of Reconstruction on his cabinet or popular sentiment or withy, but he had total control of the military and he's the one who decided to hand over the South to the KKK, Red Shirts, and White League to do with as they wished.